There are words that survive their authors, phrases that carry the weight of entire souls long after the voice that birthed them fades. Carl Jung left behind one such sentence: "The most dangerous thing is to help others before healing yourself." Most never saw it in context. It was not a slogan or a philosophy. It was a quiet confession written in a letter, hidden between thoughts on transference and the shadow. But that line became a prophecy, especially for those who feel everything too deeply. Jung foresaw a new kind of suffering that modern language would later call empathy burnout. He observed the ones who absorb pain like sponges, who sense storms in others before they can name the clouds forming within themselves. They believe that love means dissolving, that compassion means becoming the container for everyone else's chaos. And in doing so, they slowly disappear. He wrote that the healer is often the one most in need of healing. Because when empathy becomes survival, it no longer heals, it consumes. You begin to identify so completely with the suffering of others that your own psyche starts to fracture, torn between the need to protect and the need to exist. It's not love anymore, it's fusion. And fusion, Jung warned, is the death of the individual self. He saw it happening not only in therapists or spiritual guides, but in ordinary people, mothers who forget their own names in service to their children, partners who call codependency devotion, friends who mistake exhaustion for loyalty. He called this a loss of center. The moment the self stops being the axis of the psyche and becomes the orbit around another's world. The warning wasn't about selfishness, it was about wholeness. Jung believed that love without boundaries was not divine, it was dangerous. He said that the unconscious punishes every act of self-betrayal with symptoms: fatigue, anxiety, emptiness, depression. These are not random afflictions. They are messages, whispers from the forgotten parts of you, asking to be seen again. He wrote to a colleague once, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that is what he meant by the lost warning. If you keep shining for everyone else, your own darkness will devour you quietly. Not out of cruelty, but because nature seeks balance. You cannot save what you haven't yet understood within yourself. So this is where it begins, not as a sermon, but as a remembering. The empath's tragedy is not that they feel too much, but that they were never taught how to feel for themselves. And the forgotten warning was never meant to silence their light. It was meant to teach them how to keep it alive. Empathy is often romanticized, portrayed as a sacred gift, the mark of higher souls. But Jung would have disagreed. He saw it as a psychological adaptation, born not from abundance, but from absence. He believed empathy begins where unconditional love ends. It is what a child develops when they realize that their safety depends on anticipating the moods of others. In his view, the empath is not born under a blessing, but under pressure. From a very young age, they become emotional translators, decoding the tension in a parent's sigh, the danger hidden in silence, the slight change in tone that predicts rejection. It's a form of hypervigilance disguised as kindness. The child learns, if I can feel what others feel, I can prevent chaos. I can keep love alive. And so empathy becomes armor. That's why so many empaths, as adults, confuse anxiety with intuition. They think they are reading energy, but often they are scanning for threat. The same nervous system that once kept them safe now traps them in a cycle of emotional overexposure. They feel others before they feel themselves. They heal others before they dare to rest. Jung would have called this a complex, an autonomous system in the psyche that takes control whenever fear of rejection appears. He would say that such empathy isn't compassion but compulsion, a drive to restore harmony at any cost, even if that cost is self-abandonment. He once wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." And that's what happens when an empath tries to save the wounded. They are not just helping another person. They are unconsciously trying to rewrite their own childhood, to finally save the version of themselves that no one else could. But empathy that begins in survival cannot end in peace until awareness enters. Jung warned that every defense mechanism, no matter how noble it seems, eventually becomes a prison. The empath's prison is invisible, built from love, maintained by guilt, guarded by fear. They keep giving, believing it's divine. But inside, the psyche whispers a different truth. You were never meant to be everyone's healer. You were meant to become your own. To find that freedom, Jung said, one must confront the illusion that feeling others deeply equals understanding them. True empathy, he believed, is not about merging, it's about witnessing. It is love with boundaries, compassion with consciousness. It is the courage to say, I see your pain, but I no longer have to bleed with you. Behind every empath's calm, there is a child who grew up negotiating love. That child learned that peace in the house depended on their silence, that safety meant self-erasure, and that being good meant being invisible. So they learned to read faces before words, to soothe tempers before tears. They became small gods of emotional balance in homes built on chaos. And years later, those same children became adults who mistake compassion for penance. They rush to fix others because deep inside, they still hope that healing someone will finally make them feel worthy. Jung called this the wounded healer archetype. He saw it as the paradox of the soul. The desire to mend others arises from the wound that was never acknowledged. He wrote that every true healer is driven by pain, and that pain is sacred only when transformed, not when worshipped. But many empaths never complete that transformation. They live in the wound, decorating it with kindness, performing redemption over and over. They call it purpose, but it's compulsion, and the world applauds them for it, for being selfless, generous, endlessly available. No one sees the exhaustion beneath the light. Jung said, to heal others, you must first touch your own darkness and make peace with it. That means facing the truth. Sometimes, healing is just another way of avoiding your own pain. The empath becomes addicted to helping because it gives them identity, a sense of worth that was once denied. But each act of saving another delays their own resurrection. Imagine that child again, the one who learned to be small, now grown, still kneeling before the wounds of others, whispering, if I can fix them, maybe I'll finally be enough. But the healing never ends, and neither does the emptiness. Because what they truly needed wasn't to fix anyone, it was to be held, seen, and allowed to be selfish for the first time. Jung's warning echoes here louder than ever. The danger of becoming everyone's healer is forgetting that you, too, were the wounded one once. And healing that child, the one within, is the only path that leads from empathy to wholeness. Every light casts a shadow, and Jung warned that even compassion, the most celebrated human virtue, is not free from darkness. He called it the shadow of goodness, the hidden part of us that uses kindness to control, that gives not out of love, but out of fear. When empathy becomes identity, helping others turns into compulsion. You begin to confuse being needed with being loved, and helping with existing. You can't rest unless someone else is broken. Jung wrote that the ego has a way of disguising its hunger under noble masks, and for the empath, that mask is endless generosity. He would say, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But the empath rarely looks inward. They are too busy keeping others from collapsing. Imagine this. You're in a relationship, maybe with a partner, maybe a friend. They are unstable, unpredictable, always in crisis. You tell yourself you can handle it because you're strong, patient, understanding. You keep answering every late-night call, absorbing every outburst, explaining away every cruelty. And when they apologize, you say, it's okay. I know you didn't mean it. But deep down, something tightens, a quiet resentment, a sense of invisibility. You don't notice it at first. You call it fatigue. You call it empathy. But it's neither. It's depletion. That's how the shadow works, silently, like a thief. You think you're helping them heal, but you're only keeping the cycle alive. Because your need to be the savior is just as strong as their need to be saved. Two wounds locked in a dance, one giving too much, the other taking too much. And Jung would say that both are manifestations of the same unconscious imbalance, the fear of facing one's own emptiness. He called this psychic inflation, the ego's subtle intoxication with the illusion of holiness. You start to believe that your love can rescue anyone, that your presence can rewrite someone's pain, and that illusion feels divine until it destroys you. Imagine this. You're the one everyone calls when they fall apart. You soothe them, listen to them, hold their storms in your hands until your arms shake. You tell yourself you're fine, you're the strong one. But one night, after helping someone else through another emotional fire, you come home and sit in silence. Your chest feels heavy. You scroll through messages that say thank you, I don't know what I'd do without you. And instead of feeling grateful, you feel hollow. That's the shadow speaking. The part of you that's tired of being light. The part that knows your empathy has become a cage. And Jung would say that's when the unconscious begins its rebellion. Because every time you say yes while your soul whispers no, your psyche takes note. Until one day, it decides to intervene, not out of cruelty, but mercy. That intervention has a name. It's called collapse. Collapse doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes disguised as peace. It sneaks in softly, wearing the face of calm, whispering, "You're fine." And for a while, you believe it. You tell yourself that you just need rest, that everything will return to normal once you sleep enough, once you take a weekend off, once you stop caring so much. But it never does. Because what's breaking isn't the body. It's the architecture of the soul, the invisible scaffolding that once held your compassion upright. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that's what collapse really is. The moment the light you gave to everyone else turns inward and reveals the darkness you've ignored. At first, you mistake it for fatigue. Then it becomes something heavier, a quiet ache that no amount of sleep cures. You start noticing the distance between what you feel and what you show. Smiles begin to feel like rehearsals. Laughter becomes thin. You start living on autopilot, functioning, producing, helping, but something essential has gone missing. The empath's collapse rarely looks like chaos. It looks like efficiency. You keep doing everything right, but it all feels wrong. And in that contradiction, a subtle grief begins to bloom. You're grieving yourself, the version of you that believed empathy was endless. There's a woman named Anna. She worked in healthcare, where everyone adored her. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who stayed after shifts to comfort patients long after visiting hours ended. She told herself she was fine. After all, she was doing what she was born to do, help. But something inside her was fading. She stopped listening to music. She forgot what silence without responsibility sounded like. At night, she dreamed of falling asleep standing up, surrounded by voices calling her name. Then one morning, she entered the hospital and felt nothing. No sadness, no empathy, no connection, just an eerie quiet. I remember touching a patient's hand, she said, and realizing I felt like glass. Transparent, brittle. There, but not there. That's when Jung's warning came alive in her life, the one he gave about the healer who absorbs too much. He called it psychic infection, when the unconscious of others enters you like a mist, blurring where you end and they begin. To Jung, empathy without boundaries wasn't virtue. It was possession. The healer becomes a vessel for projections, filled with pain that isn't theirs, carrying shadows they were never meant to hold. When that happens, the psyche revolts. It begins shutting down senses, muting emotions, disconnecting thought from feeling. Modern science calls it empathy fatigue, the overactivation of mirror neurons. You feel others' pain as if it were your own, until your brain starts numbing itself as a survival strategy. And that numbness feels terrifying. You begin to think, something's wrong with me. I've lost my heart. But Jung would have said the opposite. That numbness is not failure. It's your soul's last defense. Its way of reclaiming energy that's been leaking for too long. It's as if your entire being says, if you won't stop giving, I'll stop feeling. This is what alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the descent into darkness where everything false burns away. For Jung, this wasn't the end of healing, it was its beginning. Because no one transforms in the light. Transformation begins in the ashes. He compared it to the myth of the phoenix, the creature that must turn to dust before it can rise again. Collapse, then, is the burning, the sacred undoing of illusions you mistook for identity. Anna told me she once sat in her car after that day and cried for hours. She said it wasn't sadness. It was realization. That she had spent her entire life giving until nothing was left to give. And that her exhaustion wasn't weakness, but honesty finally speaking. She left her job soon after. Not forever, but long enough to remember who she was when she wasn't helping someone. For months, she did nothing heroic. She walked in silence. She learned to cook slowly. She let her phone ring. She started each day with a single question. What do I need today? At first, she felt selfish. Then she realized it was survival. Jung wrote, "The purpose of pain is not destruction, but the growth of consciousness." That's what Anna discovered. That collapse is the psyche's way of reclaiming sacred space. When you ignore your boundaries long enough, your body will enforce them for you. It will whisper, then shout, then shut down entirely until you finally listen. He believed that the healer's exhaustion is not a curse, it's a message. The unconscious saying, you were never meant to carry everything. You were meant to understand why you tried. And that's the paradox of the empath. You collapse not because you're weak, but because you've carried too much for too long. The nervous system breaks to rebuild. The heart empties to refill. The silence that follows isn't a void, it's recovery disguised as nothingness. If you've ever been there, sitting in that quiet after years of saving others, don't rush to escape it, because that quiet is sacred. It's where your soul takes inventory of everything you've lost to survival. It's where you finally meet yourself again. There's a strange beauty in collapse, because once everything falls apart, the only thing that remains is truth. And that truth whispers the same message Jung once wrote to a student drowning in fatigue. Only when you are alone can you know if your light still burns. So if you are in that place, if you've gone numb, if you've lost your spark, if you're too tired to care, know this, it isn't the end of your empathy. It's your empathy transforming. It's your heart learning the difference between bleeding and beating. The collapse is not your punishment. It's your initiation, and the blackness that terrifies you now is not darkness. It's fertile soil, where your new self is quietly beginning to grow. Before every flight, a calm voice fills the cabin. In case of emergency, put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. Most people barely notice it, but for empaths, those words strike something deep, because everything they were taught about love says the opposite. That caring means giving, that goodness means sacrifice, and that the right thing to do is to help others first, even when you can't breathe. Carl Jung would have called this the moral paradox of the healer, the inner war between love for others and the forgotten duty to oneself. He believed that the unconscious constantly seeks balance, and when you give endlessly without restoration, the psyche rebels. You begin to feel anxious, fatigued, resentful, not because you've failed at kindness, but because you've abandoned balance. That, he said, was the danger of goodness, when light becomes blind to itself. He warned, the good man is often unaware of the evil he unconsciously carries within his goodness. Meaning that even the purest love, when driven by guilt or fear, becomes a shadow of what it was meant to be. Neglecting yourself is not virtue. It's pride disguised as love, the illusion that you alone must hold everything together. Modern science, nearly a century later, confirmed what Jung already sensed. Researchers at the University of Zurich discovered that empathy and compassion are not the same. Empathy activates the brain's pain circuits. You literally feel another's suffering as your own. Compassion, on the other hand, activates the brain's reward system, giving rise to warmth, motivation, and inner strength. In other words, empathy burns, compassion renews. Empathy absorbs pain, compassion transforms it into purpose. And Jung would have called that the alchemy of awareness, when emotional fusion becomes conscious love. This is what heal yourself first truly means. It's not about turning away from others, but about standing beside them without disappearing. It's the shift from I will carry your pain to I will walk with you while you face it. The first drains you, the second frees you both. That is compassion, empathy guided by consciousness. But this evolution only happens through boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are the architecture of truth, the invisible framework that keeps your soul from collapsing under the weight of everyone else's emotions. Dr. Breen Brown, from the University of Houston, found that the most compassionate people are the ones with the strongest boundaries. Because real compassion is not limitless giving, it is honest giving. You say no not to reject love, but to protect it. Without boundaries, empathy floods. With them, it flows. Healing yourself first, then, is an act of balance, not ego, not withdrawal. It's the courage to say, I, too, am worth care. It's the understanding that you cannot bring light into darkness if your own flame is dying. The oxygen mask is not a symbol of selfishness, it's a mirror of wisdom. It reminds you that love, to be pure, must include you. So when that calm voice on the airplane says, secure your own mask first, listen carefully. It isn't just protocol, it's prophecy. The soul's quiet reminder that healing begins with awareness, not exhaustion. Because only when you breathe for yourself can your compassion become medicine for others. Every transformation begins with fire. And when the empath finally stops trying to save the world, that fire turns inward, burning illusions, boundaries, and old definitions of love. It's not destruction. It's purification. In the silence that follows collapse, something new begins to form, not louder, not brighter, just truer. You start to realize that healing was never about fixing others. It was about remembering yourself. You begin to understand that empathy without awareness is sacrifice, but empathy with consciousness is strength. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole again. Not perfect, not untouchable, but integrated. The self no longer splintered between healer and wounded, between savior and forgotten child. You start living from your center instead of your scars. You learn to give without vanishing. You learn to listen without losing your voice. You learn to love without dissolving. And that, Jung would say, is the birth of true compassion, the kind that heals simply by existing. He wrote that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off parts of yourself, but by embracing them. That's what the reborn empath understands. That self-preservation is not betrayal, that stillness is not weakness, and that peace is not the absence of feeling, it's the mastery of it. Now, you breathe differently. You give differently. You no longer offer your energy out of guilt or fear, but out of abundance. You realize that being the light doesn't mean burning. It means glowing steadily, quietly, endlessly. So, The lost warning of Jung was never about turning away from others. It was about returning home to yourself, to the center where love begins and where it can finally rest. Because the world doesn't need your suffering. It needs your presence. If this message resonated with you, take a deep breath and let it settle in. Reflect on what balance means to you, and write in the comments, "I choose to heal without losing myself." And if you want to keep exploring the hidden sides of the mind, like this video, subscribe to Hidden Mind, and help this message reach others who need it. Your presence here helps this community grow, one awakened soul at a time.